Have you ever noticed a strange pattern in your relationships? Different person, same problems. Maybe you date someone who seems charming at first, but becomes emotionally distant. Or maybe someone who needs constant reassurance. Or even someone unpredictable, warm and affectionate one moment, cold the next. You tell yourself, this time it will be different. But somehow the emotional dynamic feels familiar. Almost like you've been here before. And in a way, you have. Because many people aren't just dating a person. They're dating their childhood. Not literally, of course, but psychologically. The emotional environment you grew up in shapes the way you experience connection, love, conflict, and security as an adult. And, without realizing it, your mind may be drawn to relationships that recreate those early emotional patterns, even if those patterns were painful. To understand why this happens, we have to look at how the brain learns what love feels like. As children, our first experiences with love come from caregivers, parents, guardians, or anyone responsible for our emotional safety. These early relationships teach us what connection looks like. If love was consistent, supportive, and predictable, your nervous system learned that closeness is safe. But if love was inconsistent, sometimes warm, sometimes distant, your nervous system learned something different. It learned that love requires effort, patience, and emotional navigation. In that environment, you may have developed strategies to maintain connection. Maybe you became hyper-aware of other people's moods. Maybe you learned to avoid conflict. Maybe you tried to earn attention by being helpful, successful, or agreeable. Those strategies helped you survive emotionally. But they also became the blueprint for how you approach relationships later in life. This is why, some people feel strangely comfortable in relationships that are unstable. Not because they enjoy the instability, but really because it feels familiar. The brain often confuses familiarity with safety, even if the situation is, unhealthy. Imagine someone who grew up with a caregiver who was emotionally unavailable. As a child, they might have worked hard to gain attention or affection. They may have learned to read subtle emotional cues and adjust their behavior accordingly. Now, fast forward to adulthood. When they meet someone emotionally distant, their mind doesn't immediately see a red flag. Instead, something deeper activates. It feels like a challenge they recognize. They might think, if I just try harder, I can make this work. But what they're really doing is replaying an old emotional story. A story where love must be earned. Another example involves unpredictability. If someone grew up in an environment where affection appeared inconsistently, warm one moment, withdrawn the next, they may develop a heightened emotional response to unpredictable relationships. When a partner is attentive, it feels incredibly rewarding. When the partner pulls away, it creates anxiety and a strong desire to reconnect. This cycle creates emotional intensity, and intensity is often mistaken for love. But intensity is not the same as stability. In fact, it's often the opposite. This is why people sometimes leave calm, supportive relationships for ones that feel more, exciting. The calmer relationship may feel unfamiliar. Without the emotional highs and lows they're used to, it can feel almost boring. But what they're actually experiencing is emotional safety. And if someone grew up without that safety, it can take time for their nervous system to recognize it as healthy. There's also another layer to this pattern: unresolved emotional needs. When we experience emotional wounds in childhood, part of us carries the hope that those wounds will eventually be healed. So when we encounter people who resemble the emotional dynamics of our past, something inside us believes we might finally get a different outcome. Maybe this time the emotionally distant person will open up. Maybe this time the unpredictable person will stay consistent. Maybe this time we'll finally receive the understanding or validation we missed earlier in life. This hope can be powerful, but it can also keep people stuck in relationships that repeat the same emotional patterns. Because the goal isn't really the relationship, it's the resolution of an old story. The mind is trying to repair the past through the present. Unfortunately, relationships rarely heal childhood wounds by recreating them. Healing happens through awareness. The moment you begin recognizing these patterns, something important shifts. You stop interpreting attraction as pure chemistry. Instead, you start asking deeper questions. Why am I drawn to this type of person? What emotional dynamic feels familiar here? Am I responding to who they are or to what they represent? These questions don't eliminate attraction, but they create space for choice. And choice is where change begins. Because once you see the pattern, you can decide whether to continue it. Another important step is learning the difference between emotional excitement and emotional safety. Excitement often comes from unpredictability, while safety comes from consistency. At first, safety may feel unfamiliar, and you know it might not create the same adrenaline rush. But over time, something deeper develops: trust. Trust grows slowly through repeated experiences of reliability, honesty and respect. And trust creates a different kind of emotional experience. Instead of constant tension and uncertainty, there's a sense of calm. You don't have to analyze every message. You don't have to guess how the other person feels. You don't feel like you're constantly proving your worth. That calmness can feel strange if you're used to emotional chaos, but it's often a sign of something healthier. Breaking these patterns also requires self-compassion. It's easy to look back at past relationships and think, why did I stay, or why did I choose that person? But those choices usually made sense at the time. They were guided by emotional templates formed early in life. Understanding that helps remove shame from the process. Instead of judging yourself, you can focus on learning. Each relationship becomes a source of insight rather than regret. Over time, the goal is not to eliminate attraction or emotion from relationships. It's to align attraction with awareness. To recognize when chemistry is actually a signal of familiarity rather than compatibility. To notice when someone's behavior feels like an old pattern rather than a new possibility. And most importantly, to choose relationships that support who you are becoming, not the wounds you're still carrying. Because the past may shape your instincts, but it doesn't have to determine your future. You are not required to keep dating the emotional environment you grew up in. You can learn new ways of connecting. You can build relationships based on clarity instead of confusion, respect instead of uncertainty, stability instead of emotional roller coasters. But that shift begins with a simple realization. Sometimes what feels like love is actually something older, an echo from the past. And once you hear that echo clearly, you have the power to decide whether to keep repeating it or to write a different story altogether.